Hello. I wanted to say thank you very much for the invitation. I felt very honored, and I feel it's a privilege to be here, and I'm very happy that I could come again to this wonderful conference, which has already been an inspiration on very many levels, and thank you. I'm going to talk today about patriotism. I would like to start with a quote by Paul Ricoeur from Love and Justice, where he writes, "Talking about love may be too easy, or rather too difficult. How can we avoid simply praising it or falling into sentimental platitudes? One way of finding a way between these two extremes may be to take as our guide an attempt to think about the dialectic between love and justice. As I'm thinking and writing about the possible meanings of patriotism in education, German newspapers comment on the victory of the German football team against Argentina in the World Cup final with titles such as Wir sind wieder wer, which means in English, we are someone again, and the someone gets a question mark. While asserting that we are someone again, they're at the same time raising the question of who it is that we are or have become again. The images below the title offer in a close-up of the nation, a soccer player to the left of the page, Chancellor Merkel in the middle, and a woman wearing a veil to the right of the page. While the breadth of who seems to make up Germany as a nation in these days is symbolized through the iconic depiction of soccer shoes, Merkel's trademark hand folding, so who's ever seen the picture, it's usually placed here, and the Muslim veil. The unity of all these differences is symbolized by the German flag that covers and camouflages all three of them. So nobody is actually shown with a face because the flag covers the face. And this newfound national pride is further supported by outside perspectives on the success, as foreign newspapers' titles read, quote, "World Cup victory confirms German supremacy on almost every measure," unquote. At the same time, the media report on commemoration services with politicians warning of the fanaticism and extensive nationalism in Europe leading to the beginning of World War I. Other reports follow on the crisis in the Ukraine, its struggle for national integrity and independence from Russia, on the war between Israel and the Hamas in Gaza, counting more than 1,000 civilian deaths to date, and the hoisting of the black flags of the ISIS, then it was still ISIS, signposts of thousands of brutally violent killings in the name of the erection of an Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. And since this is some time back that I wrote this article, you could add quite a lot more phenomena to the agenda, like the upsurge of a lot of very right populist nationalistic parties that often have not only an anti-immigration agenda, but also a xenophobic agenda, actually, such as the Sweden Democrats in Sweden now, such as Alternative für Deutschland in Germany, such as UKIP in the UK. And another phenomenon that could also be discussed in this list from a different angle would be the election in Scotland, which voted against the separation of Scotland from England, but nevertheless, it was not like it was a quite tight decision. So these headlines for me are indicative of why patriotism needs to be discussed in relation to cosmopolitanism, the urgency and need for clarifying our conceptions of each respectively, and critically reflecting on their possible compatibility is stressed not only by the fact that these headlines make apparent that also in our present day, for many, the notion of country remains much more than an empty signifier, but also because they illustrate the wide range of promises as well as the dangers connected to patriotism. The paper starts out by considering the reasons which Martha Nussbaum gives in more recent publications for departing from her earlier cosmopolitan position, and at least in the educational literature that I read, Nussbaum's cosmopolitan position is very widely discussed and quoted, whereas this recent turn to patriotism is hardly noticed. So now what she promotes is a, quote, globally sensitive patriotism. That's from a title of a paper in 2008. Beyond aiming at drawing attention to an as yet only scarcely discussed shift in Nussbaum's thought, though, her reasons for endorsing patriotism will be shown as exemplary for related argumentations by other authors, especially insofar as love of country as a motivating force for civic duty is understood as intention or even as incompatible with cosmopolitan aspirations. In the next part, the motivation for turning to patriotism as articulated by Nussbaum and others will be questioned and demonstrated to rely on mistaken understandings of the liberating possibilities of love of country as a possessive emotion. It will be argued that moral judgment with regard to the patria, as well as from a cosmopolitan stance, is equally tied to our sensitivities and equally requires their education. Furthermore, we will look at Axel Honneth's notion of solidarity as a form of love inflected by justice as a possible alternative for conceptualizing patriotic attachment. In the final section of the paper, I will argue that we need to transgress the inward-directed focus of much writing on patriotism and take into account an outward perspective, as suggested by Papastefanou in 2012 and 2013, including how a country is seen by non-citizens, the historical relationships to other countries, and the sort of obligations that arise in terms of historical justice in relation to other countries. If we take patriotism in this outward-looking perspective seriously, we also come to understand why it might be a mistake to skip patriotism altogether, as some critics have suggested. So I'll now turn to Martha Nussbaum's shift from cosmopolitanism to patriotism. The discussion on patriotism is notoriously polarizing. On one side of the spectrum, we find scholars such as George Kateb, who consider patriotism, quote, a mistake twice over, and find it, quote, surprising and deplorable that the mistake of patriotism is elaborated theoretically and promoted by people who should know better, unquote. On the other hand, we find scholars arguing that abandoning patriotism would imply, quote, necessarily to give up on building a democratic national community, unquote, such as was, that's a quote from Ian Callan. The worry about the loss of, quote, a shared sense of nationhood would destroy, Callan says, the fragile bond of belonging, which then can no longer serve as, quote, an instrument of political change towards justice, unquote. And that's an argument that you hear quite often by sort of scholars that want to promote secular Western democracies. Other important criticisms of a, quote, general incrimination of the politics of any national effect, unquote, as Papastefanou writes, have been raised by post-colonial theorists, arguing that the critics of nationalist patriotism's, quote, sidestepped the fact that it was precisely decolonization that, unconsciously or not, they were also attacking, unquote. That's a quote from Brennan. Interestingly, and not much noticed, Martha Nussbaum has moved from one end of the spectrum to the other. In 1996, she argued in the widely discussed For Love of Country that the worthy goals of patriotism would indeed be better served by, quote from Nussbaum, the very old ideal of the cosmopolitan, the person whose allegiance is to the worldwide community of human beings, unquote. However, in later years, and much less recognized in the academic discussion and education as well as in political theory, Nussbaum went on to change her mind and discards cosmopolitanism in order to now argue for, quote, teaching patriotism, unquote. How radical a departure she has made is shown in the following quote. This is Nussbaum again. I do not even endorse cosmopolitanism as a correct, comprehensive doctrine. Further thought about Stoic cosmopolitanism, and particularly the strict forms of it developed by Marcus Aurelius, persuaded me that the denial of particular attachments leaves life empty of meaning for most of us, unquote. So what she does in this quote, and this is quite remarkable throughout, is that she conflates cosmopolitanism in general with her version of cosmopolitanism, which is very strongly attached to the sort of strict Stoic notion of it. We will consider later in which way her more recent outright rejection of cosmopolitanism and the wholehearted embrace of patriotism might be connected to a certain narrowness of her own outlook on cosmopolitanism. Furthermore, in a closer analysis of her arguments for this change of mind, we'll find that Nussbaum's, quote, notion of a globally sensitive patriotism is not the easy target that many critics of patriotic attachment and concomitant education set for themselves, unquote, according to Papa Stefano again. Nonetheless, we will also find that the underlying conception of patriotism and the hopes connected to it are constructed in a way that creates an artificial tension and ultimate incompatibility with cosmopolitan aspirations, and furthermore seems to not serve well what Nussbaum considers the worthy goals of patriotism to begin with. So which reasons does Nussbaum give for her shift to patriotism in education? First of all, she stresses the, quote, importance of particularistic forms of love and attachment, unquote, as providing, quote, the foundation of political principles, unquote. So secondly, she says that cosmopolitanism implies, quote, the denial of particular attachments which leaves life empty of meaning for most of us, unquote, and that, quote, the solution to problems of particular attachments ought not to be this total uprooting, so destructive of the human personality, unquote. This brings to mind an argument which Alistair MacIntyre developed already in 1984, that the moral standpoint and the patriotic standpoint are systematically incompatible, since the partiality of the patriot stands in blatant contradiction with a widespread understanding of liberal morality, holding that moral judgment and action requires us to, quote, judge as any rational person would judge, independently of his or her interests, affections, and social position, unquote. It is apparent that Nussbaum in her later writings seems to align the stance of the cosmopolitan with this understanding of morality, and that she seems to agree with MacIntyre that the strongest argument for patriotism being a virtue lies in the following rationale. This is a quote, a longer quote from MacIntyre's early essay. If, first of all, he writes, it is the case that I can only apprehend the rules of morality in the version in which they are incarnated in some specific community, and if, secondly, it is the case that the justification of morality must be in terms of particular goods enjoyed within the life of particular communities, and if, thirdly, it is the case that I am characteristically brought into being and maintained as a moral agent only through the particular kinds of moral sustenance afforded by my community, then it is clear that deprived of this community, I am unlikely to flourish as a moral agent. Detached from my community, I will be apt to lose my hold upon all genuine standards of judgment. End of quote. In her arguments for patriotism, Nussbaum appears convinced that cosmopolitanism, in a similar sense that MacIntyre puts forth for liberal morality, would require us to be an impartial actor, quote, one who in his impartiality is doomed to rootlessness, to be a citizen of nowhere, unquote. Also in philosophy of education, it has been argued that, quote, national sentiment can provide this bonding, unquote, that's from John White, which is needed to transcend immediate self-interest, and that the love of country is an important means to underpin the civic friendship which is required to animate citizens for projects such as the fair redistribution of goods. In my prior work on cosmopolitanism, I have already contested the conceptualization of cosmopolitanism as a form of identity which stands in opposition to local or particular forms of being bound. In line with other proponents of rooted cosmopolitanism, I have stressed the importance of the critical dimension of Diogenes' claim to be a citizen of the world, arguing that the real conflict line does not lie between a stylized universalism and particularism, but that the, quote, distinction which should matter is that between a badly understood cosmopolitanism, which means nothing but the economically inspired extension of reification on a global scale, and between a critical cosmopolitanism, which provides an analytical descriptive as well as a normative resource for theorizing the withstanding, untangling, and going beyond such reifications on a global scale. As Papastefano carefully works out in her article on Nussbaum's turn to patriotism, it is precisely the narrow fixation on the late Stoic conception of cosmopolitanism which traps her political thoughts in either-ors. And the, quote, oppositional connection of cosmopolitanism and patriotism as attachments that operate at cross purposes, which effaces the possibility of conceptualizing them as a set and a subset whose synergy has mutually corrective and directive effects. However, before looking more closely into the ways in which critical cosmopolitanism might be argued to be compatible with a critically understood patriotism, according to Papastefano, I think it's worthwhile to look at the way in which the understanding of moral judgment as abstraction from all particular attachment and sentiment is inherently mistaken, which puts into question the main argument given for the conception of patriotism by both McIntyre and Nussbaum. So, questioning the motivation for teaching patriotism. We have seen in the previous discussion that one of the main incentives for Nussbaum to encourage patriotism and dismiss cosmopolitanism is due to her conviction that cosmopolitanism requires the denial of particular attachments, thus undermining the very basis on which we first develop into moral actors. In the following, I would now like to take a look at the intricate argument which Alice Crary has put forth in Beyond Moral Judgment regarding the question of the impartiality requirement for moral judgment. That's a book from 2007. Her line of reasoning is of great interest here because it pinpoints the internal confusion I find with Nussbaum's conception of cosmopolitanism and the conclusions that follow for her endorsement of patriotism. Following the later works of Wittgenstein, Crary has developed a thoroughgoing criticism of what she names the, quote, abstraction requirement, unquote, which is widely spread in many varieties of contemporary moral theory, and which she argues is internally confused. Crary instead draws an image of natural language as a non-neutral and intrinsically moral acquisition, and she argues that, quote, learning to speak is inseparable from the adoption of a practical orientation towards the world, specifically one that bears the imprint of the speaker's individuality, unquote. So when we learn how to use a concept correctly, we do not make a reference to a fixed linguistic competence, but we know intrapersonal differences through, for example, age-dependent cognitive differences, and we also know interpersonal differences in relation to the understanding of symbolic meanings, for example, which we take into consideration when we judge the correctness of the use of a particular concept. In this way, learning a language, we also acquire different intra- and interpersonal practical orientations, which, quote, encode a view of what matters most in life or how best to live, unquote. So that, quote, learning to speak is inseparable from the development of an individual moral outlook, unquote. Hence, she demonstrates that if it is not possible to get our minds around how things are independently of the possession of any sensitivities, we make room for an alternative conception on which the exercise of rationality necessarily presupposes the possession of certain sensitivities. Crary recognizes that a certain form of impartiality might be required for moral judgment, but she also emphasizes that in ordinary situations, what we mean by impartiality is merely, quote, an abstraction from those routes of feeling that threaten to distort moral judgment, unquote, and that this should not be confused with a philosophical question of whether every affective propensity we have as such represents a potential threat to judgment. In her account of moral judgment, which is grounded in the idea that there is a moral dimension to all of language, there is room for cases in which an ascription of subjective properties, quote, figures in the best, objectively most corrective accounts of how things are, and further that the person who lacks the subjective endowments that would allow her to recognize them is simply missing something, unquote. If Query's analyses are correct, then moral judgment with regard to our patria, just as much as in a cosmopolitan stance with regard to global issues, is deeply tied to our sensitivities and requires abstraction from some of these sensitivities only insofar as these might preclude sound judgment. More importantly, it requires a thoroughgoing education of these sensitivities in order to be able to arrive at an objective and rational assessment of how things actually stand and what course of action is the right one to take. The idea that a genuine affective dimension plays an important role also for cosmopolitanism, and that cosmopolitanism should not be reduced to merely legalistic negative duty, quote, based on some relationship of reciprocity of benefits, unquote, as McIntyre describes it, was recognized by Nussbaum in her early reply to the critics in her writing on cosmopolitanism. She then defended that children, quote, long before they encounter patriotism, they know hunger and loneliness. They have probably encountered death. They know something of humanity, unquote. So that's Nussbaum in 1996. And that by not letting themselves become encrusted by the demands of local ideology, they were able to respond to a human face and form, unquote. While the patriotic stance here became strongly equated with ideological nationalism, the cosmopolitan stance, the response to human face and form, was clearly identified with more than a narrowly rationalistic, principled dutifulness. What seemed to have changed her opinions in the following years is the idea that educating national sentiment, since directed at a circle that is closer to the self than the whole world or humanity as such, is able to engender, quote, stronger sentiments of love and support, unquote, than educating for cosmopolitanism ever could. And it's in the very end of her article on towards globally sensitive patriotism that she says that if we leave symbols, if we leave rituals, if we leave the emotions to the right forces are going to take, the right-wing forces, right with a big R, are going to take over. So what she's proposing is a kind of reclaiming of patriotism for an agenda of social justice. So Papastefano has developed a convincing critique of Nussbaum's model of concentric circles and has suggested an eccentric model of cosmopolitanism instead. Indeed, in her discussion of Aristotle's argument against Plato, Nussbaum betrays most overtly her model of love as one that not only starts from the self, leads outside and back to the self, but as a model of love of country which is thoroughly emotivist and possessive. In apparent agreement with her reconstructed Aristotle, she summarizes his insights, claiming that, quote, to make someone love something requires making them to see it as their own and preferably also as the only one they have. There is a lot that could be said about this conception of love. Thinking about even closer circles than the nation, we could wonder if we would consider it a genuine form of love if our partner, parent, or child would really primarily love us because they consider us their own or the only one they have. But leaving these broader questions aside, it seems doubtful that a love so conceived could actually do the kind of work that Nussbaum wants for the worthy goals of patriotism, namely the decentering of the self. Would such a possessive emotion not really just lead to an extended self-centeredness, an extended sense of self-importance and egotism, a form of self-aggrandizement, much in the way as Khatib claims that patriotism is, quote, only disguised self-worship, unquote. Such a conception would then contribute to the opposite of what Nussbaum hopes patriotism to do. It would certainly not lead to, quote, the sacrifice of self-interest, unquote, in the struggle for justice. I would like to suggest that if we are looking for a form of love or emotional affective attachment to others which can play the role of the cement of society, we do not need to drag up such loaded words as sacrifice, reminiscent of religious martyrdom, but might be better off looking in a place such as Axel Honneth has demarcated in his struggle for recognition in terms of social esteem or solidarity. As is well known, Honneth distinguishes between three different, maybe it's not so well known here, this is more for a German audience originally. Honneth distinguishes between the three different forms of recognition that he considers essential for identity formation: love, moral respect, and social esteem or solidarity. While love describes the forms of unconditional and highly partial personal recognition one receives from primary caretakers and in romantic relationships, moral respect should be accorded equally to everyone regardless of their personal traits or features. However, his interpretation of Mead and Hegel leads Honneth to stipulate that these forms of recognition in themselves are not sufficient. Rather, in order for a society to not succumb to a merely legalistic structure based on negative freedom and constraints, we require a third form of recognition, a form of social esteem which is accorded to each individual of a society qua individual, which means an appreciation of the specific values and contributions a concrete person brings to the community, and which implies our active and positive interest in the projects that another person pursues. Its demands go not as far as the demands and commitments of personal love, but solidarity is effective sentiment inflected by the logic of justice, in a similar vein as Ricoeur argues that while the logic of love, the logic of superabundance, is distinct from the logic of justice, the logic of equivalence, they need to be dialectically related to each other. So I now come to the final chapter, I hope.
Well, you have about 12 minutes left.
Okay, genau, that should be enough. But where do these reflections on love and solidarity leave us with regard to the question of the meaning of patriotism for education and its relation to cosmopolitan education? As we have learned from Crary, good moral judgment requires the education of practical sensitivities just as much for the patriot as it does for the cosmopolitan. As we can learn from Honneth and Ricoeur, it is just as undesirable to teach patriotism as it is undesirable to teach cosmopolitanism purely driven by the logic of equivalence. Surely we can and should aim to foster solidarity in a local just as much as in a global context. But what is the place then for patriotism in education? In which way does it retain a distinctive sense from cosmopolitanism? Much of what I have said so far could be read as suggesting a form of civic or even constitutional patriotism, as suggested most prominently by Habermas, and it could be argued that to be served well by underpinning it with national sentiment, within appropriate constraints, as suggested by John White. In my prior work on cosmopolitanism, I have argued that the main critical impetus of a cosmopolitan stance is to commit ourselves to non-reifying forms of boundedness and to taking responsibility for making the situational and historical context of our own claims and demands visible, as well as gaining an understanding for the context in which others might raise claims and demands towards us. This context sensitivity leads to an understanding of patriotism, which I would like to spell out in terms of two main aspects which Papastefano has importantly drawn attention to in her reconceptualization of a critical patriotism. She points out that much of the recent literature on patriotism has focused on what she terms an internal patriotism, stressing the importance of patriotic bounds and the obligations to compatriots whose enacting is assisted through patriotic affect and sentiment. Looking at recent publications on patriotism in philosophy of education, this inward-looking perspective appears indeed prominent. When Michael Hand discusses the benefits of patriotism as a, quote, spur to civic duty and as a, quote, source of pleasure, unquote, he considers patriotism only in terms of its relevance for the patriots of this patria, but not in terms of its relationship to its outsiders. Only when discussing the negative effect of patriotism as an impediment to civic judgment, the external perspective becomes indirectly activated in the example of the, quote, immoral imperial excess which has been part of America's presence in the world, unquote. Papastefano, in contrast, argues for the necessity of emphasizing an outward-looking perspective for a critical patriotism, which, quote, raises legitimate demands and protects the rights of a particular people without nationalist claims to superiority and expects its people to be fair to others, unquote. While the focus of external patriotism lies on debates about how one's patria is or should be, in contrast to the cosmopolitan concern with the whole world, it is nevertheless compatible with a broader and critical cosmopolitanism and does not stand in contradiction to it. Eamon Callan's definition of patriotism as, quote, a project of a collective self-rule in which the achievement of domestic justice is combined with due regard for the rights and interests of others with whom the world is shared, unquote, only superficially includes the external perspective. The external perspective on patriotism, which Papa Stefano claims, runs deeper. It calls attention to the fact that our picture of our own patria also has to take into critical account outsiders' point of view on it. Thus, critically reflecting on relations with national others becomes a visible demand and an integral part of patriotism, which then becomes compatible with a critical cosmopolitanism while still having a distinct character and function. It allows clarifying the political obligations that arise for the patriot because of her country's implication in the history of its outside, and it helps to make sense of the way in which patriotism can become politically activated, as in the wave of decolonization, which started in the second part of the last century. Civic and constitutional patriotisms run the danger of underestimating, quote, that national distinctiveness has had a specifically empowering role in people's resisting domination, unquote, and they do this through a depoliticized understanding of culture, according to Papa Stefano. Therefore, in addition to stressing and demonstrating the legitimacy of this outward dimension of patriotism, she furthermore proposes to shift the focus of patriotism from the nation back to ethnos. Nation is not only easily conflated with a nation-state and carries negative associations to the historically predominant exclusivist and arrogant stance of nationalisms, but it also relates back etymologically to the Roman goddess of birth and origin. Ethnos, in contrast, can be shown to carry connotations which, quote, bring together the stability of the common abode, home, with the mobility of flow and a common navigation, the collective passage, homelessness, through a half-remembered, half-forgotten past and an unknown and uncertain future, unquote. It's from Papa Stefano. In the idea of ethnos as a group of people or animals cohabiting a specific land and having a specific way of life, the notions of birth and hereditary lineage remain secondary. While she remains wary of the pitfalls of ethnos as well, she argues that patriotism could, quote, better be theorized by the term ethnic rather than national, because the word ethnos comprises as yet unexplored counterfactual possibilities, unquote. As I'm writing this paper, I'm myself in the process of relocating from Germany to Sweden for the next years to come. What might distinguish the love that I might find or grow towards my new country of residence from the love that countless other Germans not living in Sweden already nevertheless feel for Sweden or towards Sweden? This German romance with Sweden is a love based on projective images, not originating in but fostered through highly popular TV crime shows and romantic family dramas set in Sweden and produced for the sentimental desires of the German audience. The most blatant difference, as I see it, will not lie primarily in the inward, emotivist dimension of patriotism, but in what Papa Stefano characterizes as the outward dimension. Insofar as I'm enjoying immediate benefits and profits from being a Swedish resident, I might have to consider other obligations to and claims by those countries with which Sweden has been historically entangled. And insofar as I come to enjoy and maybe love aspects of the specific way of living in this country, my transformed cultural identity might become politically activated in case of perceived threat to that which I might have come to cherish in ways that the German television audience might not get politically activated. Thank you very much. That was the end of the talk already.
Questions? Can we just have hands up so that we see? Well, let's start with you.
Claudia, thanks for that. Just a couple of questions. First, I really like your argument about the problematic self-aggrandizement that some of the contemporary nationalisms would lead to, patriotisms rather. But I'm just thinking you might perhaps need another layer in your argument in response to the idea of a sort of respectful self-aggrandizement, a non-contemptuous one that is tolerant and doesn't create an other. If the very idea of patriotism is this is how a country has always been, maybe that kind of self-aggrandizement is not a problem because it's not leading to the problems that... So you may be able to deal with that, but it requires another layer of why self-aggrandizement is a problem. And secondly, I'm thinking of a form of constitutional patriotism, for instance, which, again, does not create an other. So Jan Mueller, for instance, argues that you don't need an actual other, but a historical counterfactual other would do so. Germany, for instance, looking back at its past and saying that's the other, and this is the current Germany that we, current sort of constitutional principles that we are attached to, in which case there's no actual othering happened except for saying that we left those principles behind and we celebrate these particular principles. So how would you then defend, say that it's still leading to self-aggrandizement?
Do you want to answer that? And then
if I understood correctly, what you were saying is that you wish there would be a further argument on why the sort of self-aggrandizement of patriotism is a problem. Okay. I think it's not going to be hard to find at least historical examples of why this is. And I'm not sure if you're asking for more sort of historical corroboration or if you're asking for an analytic kind of moment in there. But I could consider that when I look at the paper again. For your second question, with constitutional patriotism, my problem is not that it also leads to self-aggrandizement. I think there could be arguments made that it could, in case I consider this constitution in this sort of proprietarian and emotional way that might lead also to sort of feeling better than others without a constitution as I have in my country. So in that sense, I think you could take this line. My problem with constitutional patriotism is that it does not, it still leaves open the question why a lot of people do appeal to patriotism or what patriotism seems to do, and that it reintroduces this effective dimension of why I should feel strongly for the others, at least in my country, why I should be interested in fighting for the social justice. So the sort of motivating component is not there because the effective dimension is very explicitly not there. So this was the issue with constitutional patriotism that I raised. I did not really consider it in relation to the sort of self-aggrandizement. Thank you.
I just wanted to call your attention to the fact that some societies, like say India, are very pluralist in nature, and there are nationalisms as well as sub-nationalisms. There's a history of the nationalist movement having played an important part in the struggle against colonial power. So would you, I mean, I don't, of course, have any particular question or response, but do you think your analysis would also take into account the essentially pluralist nature of some societies, like, say, India? I mean, there is the Indian nationalist movement, the feeling of say, patriotism towards the country, but there's also a Tamil nationalism or something of that sort, which is like a sub-nationalism. There could be identities based on ethnic, linguistic, religious backgrounds, which sometimes come in conflict with, or in some way have to cohere with the identity of being a citizen of the nation and so on. So what would be your response to that?
When Nussbaum first wrote about cosmopolitanism, her stance was very clear. Like, as soon as my first attachment is not with humanity as such, I failed as a cosmopolitan, and it introduces, and she actually has this line, and it's an example from India that she does give, that then I start saying, I'm a Hindu before I am a human being. Then I say, no, but I'm also a father before I'm a Hindu, before I'm a human being. So the particular identities just gain all the place, and I lose my obligation to humanity as such. I think it's this kind of a strong demand for a detachment from local identities, from local affiliations, that leads to her ultimately having to say that cosmopolitanism seems to be a totally untenable or like humanly not tenable position. And there are a lot of authors that now argue for rooted cosmopolitanisms, which I think are much more adequate or much more tenable positions than the ones suggested by Nussbaum. The reason why I got interested in patriotism is from different grounds. One thing is that a paper like Nussbaum would never be written, as far as I can predict, and for now, that is. It's very unlikely to be written right now by a German scholar anywhere in Germany. It would just be felt very out of place. We have demonstrations at the moment of a movement that calls itself Patriotic Europeans Against Islamification of the Occident, or something like that. It's like 30,000 people marching once a week in the city that I studied in. It's this is why, because historically in Germany, patriotism has been associated with movements like that are, in this case, xenophobic, arguably racist undertakings. So the term is so laden that it would never be possible to argue for a patriotic education in that sense in Germany. This is why Habermas has to work so strongly into making it a constitutional patriotism. So I think there is something with where I think we have to look at the history of how patriotism has been employed, which role it has been playing in a certain. It's again about contextualizing, where historically and also geographically, before I can argue for patriotism or not. So this is the kind of the generalizing claim that Nussbaum makes based on her looking at India and at the US from her specific angle. I think it doesn't hold, not in this generalizing dimension. But at the same time, with the struggle in the Ukraine, with also the vote in Scotland, also with Papastefanou arguing as a Greek citizen living in Cyprus, I'm not sure I would feel the same way as I do if I was not German. I'm not sure I would think that, we should not discuss patriotism in any sort of positive way. So I think that there might be places in the world where you argue for a critical patriotism from a motivation that I would have to work to understanding much harder than if I lived there. So I think it's also not up to me to declare that patriotism is over, and I think that the general neglect of patriotism in academia, I think we cannot just easily go and embrace cosmopolitanism and pronounce cosmopolitanism, ignoring what is actually happening in Europe, in many European countries at the moment. So I think there is a necessity to engage with the term. But yeah, that was maybe a little lengthy answer. Sorry.
Someone there, and then after that you, and then.
Hi, Claudia. I'm a big admirer of Nussbaum's writing, and my question was, okay, maybe Nussbaum does take a position which is sort of maybe US-centric or a pluralistic society like India-centric. But in Germany, for instance, I remember seeing a picture some time ago of a building where everyone had Turkish flags on the windows. And this is apparently a pretty common practice by, let's say, families which are people who are citizens of Germany, but they have descent from, let's say, from Turkey, for instance. So in such a position where a person living in a country where a person is a citizen of a country, but might feel patriotism towards Turkey or some other country, wouldn't Nussbaum's idea of a narrative imagination, which he talks about, be far more, or I shouldn't say far more, be more effective than, let's say, critical patriotism that you talk about? I hope not.
But I'm sorry, I have to ask a question to you. Effective to what end? Effective in doing what?
Effective in, let's say, promoting a sense of brotherhood, sisterhood, humanhood, you know. Like effective in promoting, I mean, what are we aiming for? I mean, the point of Nussbaum is to create a globally sensitive society. So let's say that's the end. That's the end that we're looking for, a globally sensitive society where we're open to everyone's opinion, everyone's... I don't know if I've made myself clear. Basically, to be tolerant for everyone, to be tolerant enough to understand someone else's opinion, to be tolerant enough.
Yeah.
I mean, could you ask your question again? I mean.
But for me, I mean, like if the Turkish, or people with Turkish descent living in Germany, having German passports now, if they still like hanging the Turkish flag, it might show some sort of affiliation to Turkey, which might show care across the German border. I don't really see the problem. I think it might enhance global sensitivity rather than diminish it. But
no, because there was somewhat of a discussion regarding. Sorry.
Maybe you want to sort this out over tea, because there's one more person.
Yes.
Wanting to
I'm
ask.
sorry for not understanding better.
I have first of all, thank you for the talk. I have also a comment on that issue a little bit, but first a question of clarification about the outward external perspective to patriotism. So the question of clarification is like this. Do you think that this is a necessary condition of the very concept of patriotism, or it's kind of should be appeal? So it would be better to have an external perspective, to have a kind of critical patriotism, or do you think that this is a necessary condition of every kind of patriotism? So this is actually the question of clarification, and I think. Well, this is a very, very interesting example with the current situation in Germany, because I think that the real division is actually between a kind of civic, if you want, multicultural patriotism on the one hand, and on the other hand, ethno-nationalism. And I want to link that to your interpretation of Papa Stefano, because it sounds to me like she's arguing for a kind of ethno-nationalism in a positive way. Perhaps I misunderstood it. But if I look at the situation in Germany now, so being for a multicultural soccer team and being proud of a multicultural soccer team is one thing, and you have also Turkish and German flags and Polish flags out together, because the soccer player stems from different origins. They are players with Turkish background, with Polish background, and so on and so on. And this is, of course, a kind of patriotism. It is, of course, a question whether or not it's good to be patriotic in that way. And on the other hand, you have, of course, what you mentioned with Pegida and so on. It's a kind of really strong ethno-nationalism in terms of we need a kind of pure German leading culture, leading traditions, and so on. But I think there's two different kinds of patriotism. So I'm just wondering, would you like, or whether you comment on that or agree with that?
Maybe I take the second question first because it's more present now. How Papa Stefano reconstructs ethnos is by going into the etymology of the term, and what she says, what she finds very positive in it, is that it lacks exactly this idea of origin or birth that nationality has to it. So in her sense of ethnos, or the way that she pronounces it, is something that is more fluid, is something where people, you happen to live in this land, you could join, you could join to inhabit this land, and the way of life there would probably change with your arrival, but it's a sort of flexible notion, whereas not so tied to origin and birth would have more what you now described as, and she spent some time trying to argue that while ethnic has been interpreted in this way, it's actually not really validated by the way by the history of ethnos in the Greek language and how it was used. So for her, it has potential exactly because it does not have this. You have to be born German. And the ridiculous thing is that one of my friends, she looks a little bit Asian. Nobody knows why. It's like a big family secret. She's born 10 kilometers from Dresden, and she now frequently gets harassed on the streets to go back home. So it's like, should I go back to my village? It's like, is 10 kilometers too far to move in Saxony now? So it's more from a sort of... it shows the constructedness also of who then counts as original or not. As for the first question you asked about the external perspective and why that is, if that is a necessary condition. For me, I would have a strong problem with, or this is what I try to emphasize, is that patriotism might mean very different things in different contexts, and that therefore I would not endorse that there could be a necessary condition for patriotism all over the place. But I think that especially in the academic discussion, when you look at the literature, she's very right with pointing out that there has been this internal focus, like patriotism is always supposed to spark something towards other compatriots. It's not concerned with our obligations towards national others. Whereas for me, if we want to give sense to, we still live in nation states widely, like many of us do, except for the stateless persons who suffer from that. And this would be one to more see the effect onto the outside rather than see it as an enabler for the inside. This for me is a more promising route in thinking about patriotism than to keep repeating this sort of argument that has been around for a long time now from a more like communitarian perspective, that somehow patriotism can give us back that which we lack due to, the modernist individualization, etc., and its impact.
Thank you very much, and thank you to this audience as well.